Viridian, the Green Guide by My Head in the Clouds Not Coming Down, a Boku no Hero Academia fanfic. Chapter 38 Symphony. All for One was a simple man. He considered himself something of an expert on the subject of human nature, since an intimate knowledge of humanity and its weaknesses have served him well when building his current empire, and, despite the rumors and legends surrounding his name, he was still human. As such, he was still susceptible to the same whims that plagued lesser beings, such as boredom, which was what had led him to his current frustration. He took great satisfaction in creating plans and executing them to perfection. In his opinion, a well-constructed plan was like a well-constructed symphony, all the instruments playing their parts with few, if any, mistakes, and followed the lead, not only of the visible conductor, but of the invisible composer, who sat silently as the orchestra mindlessly followed the directions he gave them, so that every note was in its proper place and proper time, just as the composer envisioned. It was perfection. Many younger people didn't understand the complexity of the symphony. They lacked the wisdom and maturity that came with age, and quickly grew bored and annoyed, then complained about the length of the production, as if there was no reason why they should give their valuable attention to anything for longer than a few seconds. They didn't understand that they couldn't possibly comprehend what true boredom was until they had lived over a lifetime. He may have started with grand ideas all those centuries ago, but the truth was that half the reason he did the things he did at this point was because of that boredom. After a while, things like books and movies started to blend together, as the same tropes were watered down and repeated so many times that they almost became completely unpalatable. So, All for One had been left with no choice but to compose his own entertainment, with the world as his orchestra. A perfect symphony took time, which All for One had in overabundance. The composer had to find just the right instruments and manipulate each musician in just the right way to create a piece that would be entertaining enough to satisfy him, which meant that much of the fun of the composition was playing the long game to create it. The time invested in the plan made it so much more satisfying when the unwitting and unwilling participants carried it out to perfection. It was enough to give him chills, which was what made it so annoying when people got in the way of his plans. Yes, he could easily recover from the loss of the doctor's latest experiments, but it still irked him. According to his composition, Hamasaki's part in the symphony was to cause chaos on his test run so the All for One and the doctor could see the result of their experiment. He fulfilled that part of his plan well, but All for One had hoped to recover their experiment before the police could, so that it would be a marvelous surprise when he gifted Tomura with the perfect army of super soldiers. Meddling heroes and vigilantes, however, had been inconvenient. They were like audience members who, instead of sitting quietly as the composer intended, had taken it upon themselves to start playing kazoos in the middle of the third movement. It took what was supposed to be a flawless symphony and gave the entire experience a flavor that was just slightly off. It was grating. All for One was nothing, however, if not resilient. As annoying as Hamasaki's capture was, it was nowhere near enough to ruin his symphony. He'd have to keep an eye on those troublesome individuals who had led to this mistake, just in case they started to play their kazoos again. But there was no need to crush them just yet. They were inconsequential in the long view of his perfect symphony. He smiled as he thought of one of the players he had in reserve, waiting patiently under the doctor's careful care. He never intended to keep young Shirokuma. Cloud was not a particularly powerful quirk, or one that All for One had any use for. The original plan had been to capture the UA student with the erasure quirk, or, failing that, chalk the whole attack up to a failure and try again later. But then that student had soundly defeated the villain he had intended to be unbeatable, and All for One had known that the hero Eraserhead was going to be a major player in the future of heroism. It didn't hurt that his other friend, known as President Mike, had shown incredible promise when it came to publicity. It reminded All for One of himself and All Might, one working hard in the dark while the other showboated for the public. Or maybe the dynamic between Eraserhead and President Mike reminded him of himself and his brother, the original One for All. In this situation, the positions were reversed, and the All for One was the one who had been in the public eye, while his brother had chosen to stay behind the scenes to fight him, sadly limited by his own shyness. Perhaps if he and his brother had been on the same side, they could have enjoyed the same dynamic that Eraser and President Mike enjoyed today. They could have been allies instead of enemies, and ruled the world with one controlling the shadows and the other controlling the light, like he always wanted. But there was no point in wishing for a ship that had long since sailed. His brother had continuously betrayed him, even after All for One had gifted him with a quirk, and despite his best efforts, they had ended up as enemies. It was fine. He mourned the loss, but the scar was still there, angry, red, and uglier than the ones he received from All Might. So of course, when he saw the similarities in those two future heroes, he'd known he had to have a little fun with them. It was a simple pleasure, but when he was creating one of his symphonies, All for One took great delight in choosing just the right players, with just the right identities, to make an impact. Even if those identities never quite came to light, he could enjoy the delicious irony behind the scenes. So, instead of leaving young Shirokumo to die under the rubble, he warped him to the doctor and used the bribed paramedics he had intended to use for Eraserhead to have him declared dead on the scene. The boy had been quite a bit worse for wear when he'd arrived. He had 2 badly broken legs, crushed ribs, and a punctured lung that had already begun filling with blood. Still, even with all his injuries, even if he had been left under the rubble for the duration of the fight, he undoubtedly would have survived, and might have even had a quicker recovery with the use of Recovery Girl's quirk. He would have made a wonderful hero if All for One hadn't stolen him away. It was enough to make him smile. The boy's recovery, of course, had been difficult, and was made more so by the boy himself constantly fighting him and trying to escape, until All for One had finally grown tired of it and taken his memories. It would have made his betrayal much sweeter if he still remembered his old friends, but forgetting them completely would still be effective, and after his memories were gone, he had become much more docile. He had still seemed to understand that something was off, but he had stopped trying to escape. It was just a shame that All for One hadn't had access to a powerful healing quirk at the time. The doctor had done his best, of course, but his speciality was in changing people's bodies, not in putting them back together how they were supposed to be. The main problem was his ribs. They had been crushed almost into powder by the rubble, so without a healing quirk, even if they healed completely, they were still too fragile for Shirokumo to fight the way he used to, which was why All for One wanted to give him multiple quirks. The other quirks would make him stronger and faster, so that he didn't have to worry about getting hit, and All for One could call the broker to have him fitted with some kind of body armor just in case. But he still needed to be able to think, which was still an elusive result. All for One wanted it to have an impact when Eraser and Public Mike realized their old friend had become a puppet in his hands, so he wasn't willing to waste Shirokumo on experiments that was just as likely to fail. But the doctor was making progress, at least, so it shouldn't be too much longer until the newest player in his symphony was ready to take stage.